Eric was barely even a year old. A blank slate. It was unclear what kind of man he would grow up to be, although he seemed destined to not grow up to be much. He was an accident, and not a happy one. His parents didn't want children, but they also didn't want to get an abortion. And thus, little baby Eric was born, leaving his mama with stretch marks that she hated almost as much as she hated his dada for not pulling out in time. Now he was sitting in front of the TV, so he'd be in mama and dada's line of sight as they watched their shows. Their gaze rarely shifted down to him. He could have crawled into the kitchen and started playing with knives, and they wouldn't even notice. But that didn't really matter, because he didn't really do much. He mostly kept to himself, playing with the few cheap toys that they gave him. He was quiet for his age, which was great, because if he wasn't, either Mama or Dada would have smothered him in his crib a long time ago. It was a winter night where the snow clouds had blotted out the stars. It was dark in their small, messy apartment, almost at the time when Mama and Dada would put Eric to bed. The only light came from the TV. It was a pretty crappy TV. It would have probably have been considered state-of-the-art back in the 90s, but now it was a hunk of junk. But it worked fine, and it bathed the living room in its white glow. Mama and Dada watched it a lot more than Eric. Occasionally, they'd put on some colorful kids show for him, but mostly it would play their own stuff. But Eric would stare at it anyway. He saw a bit of stuff that was not appropriate for him, but it wasn't like he could understand it. One day, when Mama was flipping channels, she passed some cheesy old monster movie and stayed on it long enough for Eric to recognize the sight of a giant creature destroying a city. When she changed the channel, he started crying. Seeing how quickly it happened after switching it off, she changed it back to see if that would make any difference. Sure enough, he stopped crying and giggled almost immediately upon seeing the black and white mass destruction again. And so Mama left it on for a few minutes, just to shut him up. Eric could rarely process what is happening on TV, and his undeveloped memory could only recall a few scattered portions of his short life. But this was his strongest memory, and he could completely understand what was happening. And he loved it, because he lived in a big city like the one in the movie. The towers around him were so massive he wondered if they just went on forever into the sky. And the lack of love from his parents made him feel even smaller than he was. But now he could see that even the almighty city could be conquered. He wanted to be the creature, to show the world he wasn't so small, and to be more powerful than everything around him, and to make them pay for ever making him feel small. When the rampage sequence was over, it cut to a scene of men in suits and hats talking, and Mama changed the channel again. To her relief, he did not protest. She muttered something under her breath about him wasting her time. But right now, Eric had his back to the TV. He sat cross-legged on the dirty carpet, aimlessly waving a couple wooden blocks in the air. He was a pitiful little boy. He was clad only in a ragged diaper. He hadn't been bathed in a few days, simply because Mama and Dada forgot, and he had amassed a slight odor. He was overweight for his age and had a round belly that lay in his lap over the diaper, almost touching his legs. His face was as cute, except for emotional signs of hardship and neglect behind his eyes. Mama was on the couch with a beer in her hands. Even though it was relatively early on a Tuesday night, she had already drunk enough to feel a slight buzz. Dada sat on the couch beside her. His head was tilted back, his mouth hang open in an ugly expression, and he was snoring. An unpleasant sound, but not loud enough for Mama to consider waking him. At the commercial break, Mama stood up and left for the bathroom, leaving Eric alone with the still sleeping Dada. Upon seeing her getting up, Eric decided to get moving too. He pulled himself to his hands and knees and started to crawl. His belly dangled pathetically toward the ground and was pushed aside with every forward motion of his thighs. As soon as the door to the bathroom closed, he heard it. Eric. He turned toward the source of the whispering voice calling his name. It was unlike anything he heard before. He couldn't understand words, but he understood the voice perfectly. It was coming from the TV. A beer commercial was playing, but there was a faint shape over it, an almost imperceptible figure that others might have to squint to see over the image of happy young people drinking responsibly. But Eric was able to see it. Because it was meant for him. It was little more than a silhouette. But that silhouette was comforting. It wasn't a human shape. Anyone else who saw it would call it a monster. But he felt safe around it. To him, it was like the silhouette of one of the creatures in those educational children's shows he'd watch when Mama or Dada was feeling nice. Come to me. I can make you into what you were meant to be. Eric didn't know what that meant, but he trusted the figure. It made him feel safer and more loved than his parents ever had. So he crawled closer. That's it. That's a good boy. Eric smiled at that. He was genuinely proud of himself for pleasing the figure. He stopped when he was right in front of the black painted metal stand the TV was placed on. Come on, I know you can do it. He still needed to get closer, but he wasn't sure if he could. No, he definitely could. The figure believed in him. It chose him. Slowly, he pulled himself up to his feet. He had never stood before, and he stumbled a little. But soon, and before he even realized it, he was up on his feet. He couldn't believe it. His legs were shaking, and he had to work to keep his balance. But he was standing, for the very first time. His parents couldn't see this, but the figure could, and that was all that mattered. Great job, Eric. The excited Eric excitedly did a little dance and almost fell over, but caught himself. He had never felt this happy before. You're a big boy. Why don't you let me make you an even bigger boy now? He was even more excited now, and did another gleeful dance. But this one actually succeeded in knocking him back down. Whoops, don't worry, you can do it again. And sure enough, he did pull himself up again, and it was easier this time. He held on to the TV stand to keep himself up. Great job. Now come to me. Right up to me. He leaned forward. He let go of the stand and pressed his hands to the screen. They held his face mere inches away from the screen. The TV stand pressed into his belly. Good boy. He felt something coursing from the screen, into his hands, down his arms, and then all through his body. It felt warm. It gave him a pleasant tingling sensation in his stomach, but it also filled him with a feeling of power. He felt like he could take on the whole world by himself. Like the monster in that movie. The world around him seemed to disappear. Even the cold metal of the TV stand against his chest started to fade away. It felt softer, even began to bend around him, as if he was instead leaning on a pillow. He felt like a fire was burning inside him, and with it came a sensation to let it out and burn everything around him. Why shouldn't he? The world was cold and indifferent to him, so why shouldn't he force it to notice him? Why should? Eric, get back from the TV. Eric didn't understand what she said, but he recognized the voice of his mama. Come on, she said as she grabbed her son under the armpits. He started crying as she dragged him away from the figure. The cries woke up Dada. What the hell's going on? Eric was putting his face right up to the TV screen, she replied. I just pulled him back. After a brief pause, Dada asked, hold on, he had his face up to the screen? That's what I said. So he pulled himself right up to, Dada asked. As into his feet? Can he stand now? Mama paused. Shit, can he? She set the crying infant on the floor again. Come on, stand for Mama. Eric stopped crying as soon as Mama let go of him. But instead of standing, he crawled back to the TV. When Eric reached the TV, he pulled himself up quicker than ever and put his hands back on the screen. Shit, our boy's growing up, I guess, said Dada. I said get back from there. Mama pulled Eric back again and he started crying again. He feels warm. I hope not. I can't deal with that shit. Eric started writhing in Mama's hands, arms reaching out to the comforting glow of the television. Okay, if you're going to be like that, you're going to bed, Mama scoffed. The cries intensified as she took him away. As she left, Dada noticed a slight, semicircular indentation on the TV stand directly in front of the screen. Mama took him into a hallway with a hardwood floor. At the end of the corridor was the front door. The wall on Mama's left was adorned with rooms, including Eric's bedroom. There he'd be plopped down into his cheap wooden crib, where he'd be separated from the embrace of the TV figure by the wooden bars, the door, which he'd have to be twice as tall to even reach the doorknob. Don't worry, he heard from the living room. I knew they wouldn't let us it happen for long. We'll go further when the time comes. No, Eric didn't want to wait. He wanted more now. He cried harder and started flinging his arms at his mama. He hated her. Stop, that's not gonna do anything. I'll just let you cry it out in your room." But just before she reached the door to his room, his arm grasped at her neck, firmly, an unnatural grip for someone his age. A shocked mama froze dead in her tracks. He pulled his arm away, ripping out a piece of her neck. This part of her felt wet and meaty in his hand. A red liquid spurted from where he ripped it out. It looked so vibrant and colorful. He loved it. Mama put a hand to her throat. She tried to hold her son with her other arm, but she was too weak, and he fell to the floor. His head collided with the floor with a sickening thunk that would have killed him just a few minutes ago. But now, he didn't even feel it. He just laughed, picked himself up to a sitting position, and watched his mama fall to her knees. She was making a funny gurgling sound, and the red stuff sprayed on the floor and onto Eric. "What the hell's going on back there?" Mama heard Dada say from the living room. Eric held the piece of throat tighter in his fist. The red juices ran down his arm. In his excitement, he threw the flesh back in Mama's face. Finally, Mama fell over. Little baby Eric could not quite grasp why she did not get up again. He did not know what the red stuff that gathered around her body was. But whatever it was, whatever he did, filled him with excitement. He wanted to do that again. "Answer me, damn it," Dada said, approaching the hallway. "What was that noise?" "It's..." And then he saw what had happened. He didn't hear the crack of Eric's head over the gurgling. And even that didn't sound to him like his wife dying. He had no idea what he expected to see. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight of his wife lying in a pool of blood, and their son sitting in the puddle, grinning from ear to ear. The blood Eric was sitting in had already soaked through the bottom of his diaper, turning it almost a solid red. The blood had also splattered across his face and body. Yet, he happily splashed his hands in the puddle around his mama. Eric absent-mindedly brought his hand up to his mouth and licked the red stuff on it. It tasted good. So he started to eat more of it. He rubbed his hands in the puddle to gather more red. Finally, Dada got over his shock just enough to start moving again. He ran to his son, picked him up, and carried him away from his dead mother. He ran with him into the kitchen, where he sat him down on the floor. He picked up the phone and dialed 911. Eric looked around. Mama and her puddle of fun red liquid weren't here. But maybe he could play with Dada. 911, what's your emergency? Before Dada could answer, Eric grabbed this ankle and pulled it back. There was a loud snap, and Dada fell to the ground. Is everything okay? He heard from the receiver that had landed on the counter above him. He looked back at his leg, which was bent at the shin in a grotesque fashion. Did his son really do that to him? Did a baby really break his leg? Eric grabbed the foot again. No, let's... This time, he pulled so hard the foot broke off. Dada screamed as even more red leaked out of him. Eric nearly doubled over laughing. No, bad Eric, Dada said weakly. What exactly does one say in a situation like this? Eric played with the foot for a few seconds. After he accidentally poured some of its red liquid on his belly, he threw it aside and smeared the blood all over himself. To Dada, it looked as if he was putting war paint on his body. Eric? Why wasn't Dada going away like Mama did? He wasn't much long for this world, but Eric didn't know that. Maybe he needed to hit somewhere else. So he stood up and walked over to Dada's face. For the first time, Dada was seeing his son really walk. Any other parent would have been proud of him. Under any other circumstances, he'd only be mildly pleased. But now, he was scared for his life. Eric was just a tyke, but from the angle that Dada was looking up at him, he looked almost like a giant. His steps were clumsy but self-assured, and he never looked like he was going to fall. When he reached Dada's face, he stood over him for just a moment. In a brief burst of excitement, he laughed, and his tiny round belly, which now seemed massive, shook mockingly. Eric was a growing boy, although what he was growing into was horrifying. And with that, Eric lunged forward and purposely fell onto Dada's head. It cracked open, spewing the red liquid everywhere, but also a lot of a pink, squishy substance too. Eric laughed and pulled himself up. He looked down at the mush that was once Dada's head. Yeah, that should do it. Wow, you're even better than I thought. Eric danced with excitement yet again. It would have been cute, if not for the fact that his every inch of his chest and much of his face, arms and legs was now covered in blood, and he had little pieces of his Dada's brain clinging to his flesh. I wasn't expecting you to do that to your mommy and daddy with just the power I gave you. Now that they're out of the way, do you want to come back to me for more?" Despite having only been able to walk for a few minutes, Eric almost ran all the way to the TV. The police traced Dada's 911 call to his apartment, and soon there was a police officer knocking at his door. When nobody answered, he was forced to kick down the door and barge into Eric's apartment. The first thing he saw was the body of a woman in the corridor to the living room, lying in a pool of blood. He reported it into his walkie-talkie before continuing through the corridor with a hand on his gun. Before reaching the living room, he heard what sounded like a brief cooing of a baby deeper inside the way. It filled him with dread. Some poor baby just lost his mother, and might have even seen it. And at that age especially, that's the kind of thing that fucks up a child for the rest of their lives. But when he finally got a full view of the living room, the scene was nothing like he could have imagined. The sound came from a small, pudgy infant covered in blood, but seemingly unharmed. He was leaning on a small, outdated TV. His hands were pressed firmly against the screen, his face inches away, staring with so much intensity, it was hard to believe he made any sound at all. It looked so unnatural that it took the officer a moment to even notice the headless corpse in the kitchen to his left. But the child was even creepier. The TV he was looking at alternated between shots of a landscape of rubble and shots of dead bodies. The officer reached toward the child to reassure himself that he would react in a natural way and alleviate the uneasy feeling he had. "Hey, buddy," he whispered comfortingly. "Are you okay?" But when his hand touched the child's bare back, it felt like putting his hand on a hot stove. He cried out in pain, jerked his hand back, and looked at his red, burnt palm. When he looked up again, he saw that the child was seemingly going through the metal stand the TV was sitting on. His body had dug into the stand until it had created a hole that he fit perfectly in. The edges of the stand reached a little over halfway to his back. The officer then noticed the smell of burning and saw the thin ribbon of smoke coming from the indentation. Hot liquid metal and black paint dripped and sizzled onto the floor below and streamed down the curve of the child's belly. The TV had been pressed right up against the wall, and when the officer looked a little closer, he could see that the child's hands were on their way through the glass as well. There was obviously something very wrong with this child. Finally, the child's hands went through the screen. He fell forward a little from the lack of the screen's support, but laughed it off as he took his arms out. Eric looked through the hand-shaped holes in the black screen and saw the face of the figure, clearly for the first time. "Looks like your mommy and daddy did a good job raising a boy like you." Then, the screen exploded outward, and he felt a cold wind escaping into the world. He pulled himself away from the stand, admiring the deep impression he'd made on it. He put a hand on his belly, as if congratulating it on a job well done. The red stuff that had soaked it was already dried, and on his lower stomach area, it was joined by thin, black streaks of hot metal. A few pieces of the pink thing in Dada's head still clung to his chest, but now they looked blackened. He turned around to see a stranger in a blue suit behind him. He took a few steps closer to him. His steps were no longer awkward or clumsy. The officer backed away. He was scared to touch him again. He was afraid of him. How could he be afraid of a baby, of what he could do to him? Despite everything he saw, a part of him still felt stupid. But the rest of him knew this was not what he looked like. Not anymore. Thankfully, the child simply fell into a sitting position. Eric didn't even realize he was lifting off the ground at first. It just looked like the stranger was getting smaller. Until he saw that the room was getting lower too, and started to realize he couldn't feel the ground beneath him. He looked down and was pleased to see the ground a few feet beneath him. He was flying, and his excitement only grew when the changes started. The features that defined him as a cute, pudgy infant melted away, replaced by something more monstrous, more demonic, more cool. He looked back up at the stranger. He had a look on his face that Eric now recognized as fear. And now he finally turned to run away. But Eric didn't worry. He'd catch up to him. He knew he'd always catch his prey. As a matter of fact, the whole world was his prey now. His whole life had led up to this moment.